Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Republican strategist Patrick Griffin. Patrick, thanks so much for coming on.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Brittany.
As we sit here on a snowy Friday, we are just a weekend away from the New Hampshire primary. What do we need to know? Break it down for us.
Well, I think the most important thing to know is that New Hampshire isn't Iowa, right? This has been a long-held tradition. Iowa gets to go first. Iowa used to winnow the field, then New Hampshire would sort of pick one or two candidates to go forward. That's changed a bit. The Iowa contest has had less impact on New Hampshire for a number of years. And if you're not certain of that, you can ask President Huckabee, President Santorum, or any number of other folks who have won that primary and found themselves not in as good a shape in New Hampshire. Different place, different electorate, different turnout models, different demography. So all of that has conspired to make Iowa's influence on New Hampshire important, but not as important as it once was. So I think that we're looking for a very, very different kind of Republican turnout in this race. And also independents get to participate in this race in the state. And that should be pretty vigorous, I would think. Look for a much stronger turnout in New Hampshire, and also look for a different kind or a more varied kind of person pulling the lever or punching the ticket for Republicans than we saw in much more ideologically pure contests like Iowa.
I want to talk about the top contenders, obviously being former President Donald Trump, Nikki Haley, and Ron DeSantis. And let's talk about a recent poll, break down the numbers. A St. Anselm poll found Trump at 52%, Haley at 38%, and DeSantis at 6% in New Hampshire. So as we head into the primary, who do you think has the most to win and who has the most to lose in this state?
Well, I think that that's really interesting. I think right now, anytime you're bumping up against 50%, your expectations are very high. Donald Trump has now sort of set that expectation. In Iowa, he was able to overcome that expectation and therefore exceed what anybody in the national media thought would happen. So big win for Donald Trump. I think the problem here is nobody understands the turnout model quite yet. Nobody understands what role Democrats are going to play in, independents are going to play in this role. And I also think that if you listen to Donald Trump on the stump, there's been a lot of talking to Republican crowds about, watch out, the Democrats are going to try to interfere with your primary. Democrats cannot vote in a Republican primary. They can't do it. They could have switched party affiliations several months ago. Very small number of Democrats did that. So I think Trump's hyperbole on this issue is a little over the top. Republicans and independents, just like in a general election, have an opportunity to turn out here and pick someone they want to in the Republican Party. While New Hampshire's been accused of being too homogenized in terms of its suburban nature and its less rural area and the whiteness of New Hampshire, lack of sort of ethnical representation, the fact of the matter is the voter profile who comes out in New Hampshire looks much more like a purple state or a swing state than traditional deep red primary states.
I'm lucky to talk to you today because you've advised 5 GOP presidential campaigns. So I want to play a game here. I want you to grade each of the top 3. Grade Trump's campaign, Nikki Haley's campaign, and Governor Ron DeSantis' campaign, and break it down for us why.
Well, let's start with the obvious thing for me, at least. Ron DeSantis gets a C-. This is a guy who started with the highest of expectations. He's a very talented politician. I lived part of the year in Florida. I think he's been a pretty good Florida governor. He certainly is conservative enough, and he was sort of the conservative after Trump, deep red person to the MAGA throne, if you will. And I think that he has completely failed to achieve liftoff. This guy had lots of money, had a very important culture message, and I think he just missed the mark. We had an old slang in the advertising business that sometimes the dog doesn't eat the dog food. Doesn't matter how good the advertising is, how good the packaging is, where you are on the shelf. The fact of the matter is the more exposure voters in Iowa and New Hampshire, and it seems across the country, got to Ron DeSantis, the less they liked him. There's sort of a supernova effect to this guy. So I think that that's been an unsuccessful campaign and not a very successful candidate. He's a young guy. He could be back at some time soon. but this was a real miss in terms of the grade. So I think I'm being kind with a C minus, but it was a terrible campaign. As far as the other two go, look, I'm not a huge Donald Trump fan, but you got to give the guy some credit. Whether you like Trump or you don't like Trump, Trump knows his audience. He's always been pretty good about figuring out the room, reading the room, and giving them what they want. So I think what Trump has provided is a new direction for the GOP. Not everybody in the GOP thinks it's the right direction. But I will tell you that Trump has reinvigorated voters to come out for Republicans, as he did in 2016, not so successful in 2020. And then the real question was he done? Were Republicans done with Trump? On the basis of the comeback, just the comeback, you got to give Trump an A minus, because this is a guy whose political brand on January 7th was really dead. Lots of senior Republicans around the country, lots of people in elective politics were pushing away from Trump for obvious reasons. I mean, his behavior oftentimes pushes people away. But what I think is really important is Trump is able to point to Biden and say, do you miss me yet? And looking at Biden policies, what a failure Biden has been at almost every level, it's very, very easy to say, look, it's going to be a two-person race, me or him. You might as well get on with me. So I hate to grade Donald Trump because I don't like to necessarily give him a good grade. I'm going to give him an A minus for the comeback so far, just based on Iowa. But this is not done here in New Hampshire yet. We're still going to have to see what happens. As for Nikki Haley, look, this is a race that was stuck for a long time in one place. Nobody broke away. Trump has sort of owned this thing almost from the beginning. I give her a lot of credit for sort of coming from nowhere. She's done very well in the debates. She's very smart. She's very articulate. Have there been a couple of missteps? Yes, there have. But that happens in every campaign. I got to give her a B plus. I think so far she's done a very, very good job introducing herself to the country and counter-programming Trump. The question is, will it be enough? And can she catch him? Because right now that Trump brand is still pretty hot. So C minus for DeSantis, a B plus for Haley, and an A minus for Trump so far.
So we've got an A, a B, and a C for these contenders. And you make a really good point about nobody was able to break away to even catch up in striking distance of Donald Trump. Recent polling has him at 68%, DeSantis at 10%, and Haley at 9%. So there's really this extreme fight within the fight between Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. And everyone's talking about this, that fight for second place. But with Donald Trump so ahead in the polls right now, does it matter at all, this fight for second?
Yeah, I will tell you, I'm only speaking right now about New Hampshire. Ron DeSantis is a non-factor here. Ron DeSantis has left the state. He's abandoned his campaign. He's dismantled staff. So has his super PAC. And he's also stopped advertising completely. So there is no sign of Ron DeSantis. There's talk that he might come back and on Friday or something, on Saturday over the weekend. He's moved on to South Carolina because there's nothing here from him. So I think what you're citing is a national poll. National polls are instructive, but they don't mean as much as right now about what's going on where delegates are going to be amassed at the state levels. I think the more important point is that what we're really seeing right now is whether or not the Republican Party is going to rally around Trump because they are so concerned about Biden. They are so angry and frustrated at Biden that only someone tough enough, mean enough, and nasty enough can make sure that Biden is done, even though national polling shows that a race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump is much closer than a race between Nikki Haley and Joe Biden. So it's interesting right now. If you're a Republican, you want an annuity, national polling would suggest that Haley does better in a general election than Trump does against Biden. Trump is winning now. This idea that, well, Trump could never win a general election, that's kind of been put to bed. So I think that what we have to think about here is it's great to win a primary. It's great to be the overwhelming favorite of your party early because you get that done. The question is, how does Donald Trump perform versus the last contest where we were beaten badly as Republicans in suburbs? Women presented an enormous problem for Donald Trump. We found vast parts of the Republican Party that just didn't rally for him. And those swing states that are going to decide this election, I'm not sure much has changed. Abortion is on the mind of more voters, particularly women. Guns are a huge issue for Republicans. to navigate. I'm not sure Trump helps with any of these things with suburban women in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Florida, even New Hampshire, where there's only a small number of delegates at stake. But still, these races, as we know, Bush v. Gore, Trump versus Clinton, can be very close. Every delegate counts and every elector counts.
When you think about from 2020 to 2024, and it's largely shaping up to be a rematch deja vu of 2020, have the issues that the people of New Hampshire care about, have they changed at all in the last 4 years? And what are those issues now?
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing about New Hampshire is it's a very independent place, right? Live free or die. Pretty serious about that here. And I think that many voters are the same way. You've got a third of the country that is hardcore, ideologically right, a third of the country that's progressively left. And who really decides these things? It's really a handful of voters in a handful of states. These states that can swing either way. You cannot win an election, Brittany, without being able to look real hard at independents and invite them in the final week of a campaign. They can make the difference. Think about this in Iowa. I was looking at these numbers earlier. Between Haley and DeSantis, that was about 40% of voters in a very small subset of voters. Only 15% of voters in Iowa came out to participate. That's half of the number who participated in 2016. Weather was a problem. We know a lot of things depressed turnout. But that is a very low subset of very conservative Republicans. Among those folks, what I found interesting was not only did 40% decide not to vote for Donald Trump, but for someone else, but they also said in some of these entry surveys that while, I think 2/3 of them said, I'm not bothered by the fact that Donald Trump's been indicted. That's fair enough. Everybody's entitled to be innocent until they're proven guilty. But a third of those voters said, but if he's indicted, that's a different story. Think about that. There's a 40% protest vote against Trump, even though he's incredibly popular right now in the party. And you've got a third of these folks in this black swan primary, who knows what's going to come down in terms of the courts, who say, if he's convicted, it's a whole different ballgame for me. I'm not sure how I would feel about that if I was a Trump campaign. He's the runaway favorite right now. The question is, how does he wear on voters in a general election? Because everything else doesn't matter. Getting nominated is one thing. You've got to win in order to govern.
Do you think that his legal troubles will have an outsized impact then as we go through the primary season? And do Republicans in New Hampshire care about them that much as they head to the polls?
I think there's another old saying in politics that electability rarely gets in the way of ideology, right? Progressives vote progressively, and they're going to usually vote for the most progressive person. Conservatives tend to go for the person they believe is the most conservative, most representative of them. And when you make an argument of, well, yeah, he can't win the general election or she can't win a general election, voters don't care to hear about that in primaries. They want to get out and exercise their demons and their feelings and vote for someone who they believe is talking to them. So it's very tempting to basically say, I'm the one that can beat the Democrat, and that's clear. But it really, that's the next step of this date. It's not right now. We're just going for coffee right now. Before we get to the dancing, there's a whole lot more that goes through voters' minds. So I will tell you that I do think Trump's legal problems are there on the horizon. We are in completely uncharted territory with President Trump. I mean, we've never seen this before. He is a political phenomenon like none we've ever seen. And I think that it's very difficult to say, well, what's going to happen here is this is going to pan out this way or that way. Anything could happen. If one thing we know about Donald Trump, the story is never written until he says it. So I think we've got a lot to learn here. I think the courts will have a lot to say. In a strange way, this helps Trump among the base because he's pretty effectively weaponized the Justice Department and judges and everything else in his favor. The question is, what happens when independents and others who will make the difference in November take a look at all of this, and do they say, I've had enough? Is Nikki Haley right? Is the chaos that follows him so exhausting that voters push back and say, okay, I've had enough of the drama?
Patrick, you bring up a really good point about anything can happen because I started my career in politics, covering politics at the start of the 2016 election. So if I know anything to be true, I know it's that anything can happen. And I now do want to pivot to some breaking news that just broke a few moments before you and I started talking, and that is Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina is projected to endorse Donald Trump tonight. Now that's reported, so we don't know for a fact until he actually does. But what do you make of this news, and will it have any sway in New Hampshire this weekend heading into the primary?
Well, look, I think that one of the things, again, back to Trump's report card, one of the things that Trump has done very effectively or very frighteningly is he has basically said to the Washington Republican establishment, don't cross me. Do not cross me because I have a long memory. And, I think he said it again and again. This whole idea of running, part of this is retribution. Trump makes long lists and keeps names. So we haven't seen a lot of profiles in courage coming out of the leadership in the Senate, besides Mitch McConnell, who has never really cottoned to Donald Trump and has been pretty critical of him. I just find it interesting that Senator Scott ran his entire campaign based on sunny sort of optimism, looking at the country as an opportunity, presenting himself as a black man, having grown up in the South with a family that was positive, looking for opportunities, and that he was kind of the picture of sunny optimism and what you could do no matter what color your skin was or where you came from in terms of your lot in life. That just doesn't seem to fit, with me at least, to the Trump narrative, which is not that. It is name calling. It is lots of anger, lots of resentment, and lots of labels on a lot of people. I'm not surprised by this. This has been the worst kept secret around here for the last couple of weeks. I think this has been negotiated, and the timing is very interesting going right into this. Tim Scott helps him probably more with moderate voters than he does with terribly conservative voters. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to get into Nikki Haley's base a bit, which I understand. But I'm a little disappointed in Senator Scott. I like him a lot. I think he's a very interesting guy with a compelling story. I'm not surprised he's doing this. But again, it's hard to find profiles in courage in Washington these days, unfortunately.
I am curious as to the why. Why are we seeing these high-profile Republicans who have semi-softly distanced themselves from Trump before now throwing their support behind him, especially because let's say he does get elected, let's say he is president, he'll be a lame duck president.
Right. That's a really good point. First of all, some of these people are running for president in 4 years. We've got to keep that in mind. But forget the politicians in Washington, Brittany. Think about the fact that the people running against Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, they have not been particularly critical of President Trump. They kind of tiptoe around the problems with Donald Trump. Now, you can say, well, that's kind of smart because Chris Christie did just the opposite of that. And what did that get him? But an early bus ticket back to New Jersey. The fact is that's proven to be very bad box office. And that gives you some identification with the power of the Trump brand inside the Republican Party. This is Trump's party now. So if you've got ambitions in Washington and you're looking at this and saying, boy, it looks pretty likely that Trump's going to be the nominee and that he might beat Biden, everybody's kind of padding the floor here for the next earthquake. It's disappointing to me because I think it's healthy to have disagreements. I think you can agree with someone in terms of policy. I agree with an awful lot of Donald Trump's policies. Not all of them, but a lot of them. I just don't like the way he does it. And I think there are people out there who say, if the president could only be a little more thoughtful, careful, a little more sensitive, maybe he could still deliver that tough message. But the way he does it, I think, rubs some people the wrong way. Not apparently Republican Washington.
Patrick, as we're just days away from the New Hampshire primary, what's on your radar that you want to put on ours? What should we be looking out for?
Well, looks like it's going to be a good weather day. So we're not going to be able to make the Iowa excuse of snow. It's looking pretty good. I expect turnout to be pretty good. If we look back to your foray into politics here in 2016, there were about, I think it was almost 300,000 votes cast here of eligible voters who came out and cast votes. 44% of the state's eligible voters participated. The question becomes right now is there dissatisfaction among a group of people who actually model the turnout? How many independents show up? How many moderates show up? What percent of MAGA Republicans, if you will, are going to turn up for Trump? Do they think it's done and it's easy? I think not. I think Donald Trump's voters are pretty enthusiastic. They were in Iowa. The snow bomb couldn't keep them home. They came out and they did their civic duty. The question here is, what does the voter turnout look like in terms of the ideology of the turnout? We know conservatives will come out and vote. But I will tell you, I worked for George W. Bush in 2020. And we had won the Iowa caucus by the largest margin of any presidential candidate. We had won the Iowa caucus by the largest percentage of any candidate. Then Governor Bush came into New Hampshire, and we got clobbered here. I mean, we got clobbered. John McCain beat George Bush here significantly. And it didn't really matter because what happened? We left New Hampshire, went on to South Carolina, and that was pretty much it. Senator McCain lasted until, just another couple of weeks, and George W. Bush had the nomination. So I think what happened then was that voters came out to make a statement. It wasn't just about who they preferred to be president. New Hampshire voters, in that live free or die tradition, decided they would come out and say, yeah, I don't mind Bush, but McCain the maverick, McCain the guy who sits on the Straight Talk Express, takes unlimited questions from the audience, he's a different kind of guy and we kind of like that. The question now is, has Nikki Haley made that connection? The jury's out on that, but I think that's the crowd she's going for. Can she motivate moderate Republicans or conservative Republicans who are sick of Trump and get some folks to come out from the independent side of things who say, I value what's on my license plate. Live free or die means something to me, and I'm not quite ready to have this all over yet.
Well, that remains to be seen at least till next week. Patrick Griffin, thank you so much for joining me and breaking this all down. I appreciate your insights, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you, Brittany. Enjoyed it.